I'd like to begin by reading a letter to George and Andrew Webb from their mother, Sarah. 3rd of April, 1864. My dear son, it is with pleasure that I embrace the present opportunity of dropping you a few lines which will inform you that we are all well at present, hoping that these lines may find you in good health. I can say to you that I have just read your letters that Esquire Bird brought. I am greatly in hope that you may live through this war and be permitted to return home to the embrace of your family and friends again. Well, George, the rebels has robbed us of everything we had. They took my old mare and Joe's horse. My other old mare died. So I'm left with 2 colts, killed all my hogs but 2, took all my corn and meat. But all this did not hurt me like it did when I heard that your brother Joseph was captured. Poor fellow, I pray that he may live to get home again. I can say to you that there is not a family but what has been robbed, and if it was not for what wheat there is, the people would starve sure. We're trying to raise a little something this summer, do the best we can. Some 4 or 5 brigades of rebel cavalry camped all around me several nights, burned up a great deal of my fence. Well, Jackson, I'm glad to hear of your good health. I'm glad to hear that Rachel and the babe got safe to you. I should be powerful glad to see you safe at home. I expect you have heard that the rebels killed your old friend Jesse Taft. They shot him in his own meat house because he would not give them the last side of meat. He lived about 9 hours after he was shot. He died in great peace. I want you to write me every chance all the children wishes to be remembered, to all the neighbors and friends wishes to be remembered, to you both, and all prayers for your safe return. I must close by remaining your affectionate mother until death, Sarah Webb. George and Andrew Webb's brother Joseph never did make it home. He was taken to the Andersonville prison in Georgia. He was only 20 years old when he died at Andersonville prison. The largest, most famous of all 150 military prisons of the Civil War was Camp Sumter, commonly known as Andersonville. It was the deadliest landscape of the Civil War, where 13,000 Union soldiers died here. Hard to believe, but this is someone that lived, someone that was a survivor of Andersonville. On June 17, 1863, George Webb is writing his commanding officer, a brigadier general, asking for a leave of absence for a very important family matter. It doesn't mention it here, but I know that his daughter Mary was just born a few weeks before this letter was written. A year has now passed. June the 23rd, 1864. This is a letter from George Webb to his wife. Dear wife, it is with pleasure that I embrace the present opportunity of dropping you a few lines which will inform you that I am well, hoping when this letter comes to hand, it will find you and the children enjoying the same blessings. I am in the best of health. The boys under me are in good health. I have 42 men with me. I guarded a drove of beef cattle through from Nashville. We are herding our cattle now 7 or 8 miles south of Chattanooga. I was in Chattanooga today. It's very likely that I will stay here for several days. I have a fine camp. We're living well. We had dewberry pies for supper. The boys are all busily engaged in cooking. We will have coffee, hardtack, and bacon to finish our supper. Wounded men are coming in every day. There is more hard fighting now than there has been since the war commenced. We are losing a great many men. but we are gaining ground every day. I was 12 days on the road from Nashville to Chattanooga. I want you to write me as soon as you get this letter. Give me all the general news. I would love to see you and the children. Change the baby's name to Mary U instead of Mary L. Her name is Mary Ulysses. I will have to close for want of paper and candle and lay me down to sleep and think of you and my darling babes at home. Remaining your husband until death. Good night. G.W. Webb. Captain George Washington Webb, he made it through the Civil War. However, not long after the war had ended, he died on September the 15th, 1866, 27 years old, from wounds that he received during the war. On a side note, Mary L. Webb did not have her name changed to Mary Ulysses Webb. It remained Mary Lytle Webb. The third brother was my great-great-grandfather, Lieutenant Andrew Jackson Webb. He made it through the war. Not only did he make it through the war, if he didn't, there'd be a lot of people not existing. During the war in 1863, he had a daughter. After the war, he had 7 more children, one of which is my great-grandfather, Gordon Granger Webb. Remember how George Washington Webb wanted to name his daughter Ulysses after Ulysses S. Grant? Well, my second great-grandfather, Andrew Jackson Webb, did name my great-grandfather, Gordon Granger. They named him General Gordon Granger. Look at line 12. General GG. That's my great-grandpa. On the left is my great-grandfather, Gordon Granger Webb. And here you have the General Gordon Granger. Many people have heard about Ulysses S. Grant, but how many people has ever heard of General Gordon Granger? When I was going to school back in the 1950s and early 60s, they never talked about who General Gordon Granger was. In fact, slavery was hush-hush. Well, General Granger rode his horse to Galveston, Texas, and read to the people General Order Number 3. He told the people that were slaves that they were no longer slaves. That was on June the 19th, 1865, after the war. I went to newspapers.com and got the clipping. Many of us celebrate July the 4th. Freedom and equality for everybody. All men are created equal. However, back in 1776, all men were not created equal. We still had slavery. It wasn't until this time frame the freed slaves in Texas found out that the Emancipation Proclamation was approved in 1863, a year and a half before this time frame. And now we have freedom for all. However, we don't have equality. Today we're still working on equality, I think. Juneteenth is celebrated now actually around the world, in Nigeria, in Canada, South Korea, in Japan, everywhere around the world. Juneteenth is being celebrated. Joseph Webb and George Washington Webb died fighting to end slavery. Now, their father, James, in 1840, did not have any slaves. However, looking at the 1850 slave schedule, James owned a male 22 years old, a female 17 years old, and a baby girl just a couple of months old. No identity given to these 3 people. In December 1859, James dies, and he gives his slaves to his wife and children. They now have names. It looks like a mother, Meade, a father, Wilson, and 6 children. The next year, in the 1860 slave schedule, these people again are shown just numbers: age, male, female. One can't help but notice Wilson is missing on this schedule. Either he died, he was sold, he ran away, but what I would hope is that George Washington Webb gave him his freedom. I'll never know. 5 years after the Civil War, in the 1870 census, shown here, you can see on line 9, that's Lieutenant Andrew Jackson Webb, my great-great-grandfather, his wife. Then you can see my great-grandfather, General Gordon Granger. He's not a general. And you look on down, next door is his mother, Sarah. She's at line 18. A couple of his brothers and a sister. And if you look at line 22, 23, you see Jackson and Henry. Jackson and Henry were slaves earlier. You can see they took the Webb name. They're living with Sarah Webb. And then below them on line 24 is Bush, Daniel Bush. He's just a farmhand. Well, if you've ever gone to the grocery store and you bought Bush's beans, this is the Bush family. Sarah, when she sold her farm, she sold it to the Bush family. And today, if you go just outside of Dandridge, Jefferson County, Tennessee, Chestnut Hill, you'll find a plant where Bush's Beans happens to be located. That's where James and Sarah lived and where a lot of my ancestors grew up. Now back to lines 22 and 23, Jackson and Henry Webb, the two children that were slaves. If you're wondering about their mother, Meade, she's just right down the road. She's working as a domestic servant for another family, and she also took the name Webb. My memory's starting to get to me. Meade was a domestic servant in the 1880 census. This is the 1870 census. She had her own place down the road. You can see she took the Webb name, and she has two more children, Alfred and Nancy. I'd like to go back one more generation to my fourth great-grandfather, Jesse Owen Webb, just so we can see how the Webbs got to this part of Tennessee. Well, actually, they were in this part of Tennessee when it was called North Carolina. The American Revolution pension file number S3501 for Jesse states that he enlisted in 1781, Greene County, North Carolina, under Captain Lusk, who commanded a company in the North Carolina Regiment commanded by Colonel Middleton. The regiment was marched across the Santee River in South Carolina, later to Edward Springs, where they joined in the battle there under General Nathaniel Greene, and the brigade under General Sumter. Later, Jesse's company marched to Orangeburg, South Carolina, where they fought Tories until the term expired. So basically, all the Webbs were here in the 1700s, and Tennessee became a state in 1796. By the way, the picture that you're looking at, Chestnut Hill Cemetery, this land was donated by Jesse. Here's a picture showing that Jesse donated this land. Oh, and by the way, the third person in, he's my second cousin twice removed. That's Judge Clinton Webb, and his nickname was Spider. He was a judge, and they called him Spider Webb. I have no idea what that means. Oh, and here's a better picture of the dedication marker. About 40 years ago, when I was on a genealogy trip to Tennessee, I took this picture. This happens to be on the property where Jesse lived. Well, actually, both Jesse and Anna McMurtry, my fourth great-grandparents. And those trees is where they're buried. They died in the 1840s. And it happens to be on the Thornton property now. Thorntons own this property. When I went to the courthouse, the person that I talked to, she said, well, I'm a Webb, but now I'm a Thornton. She brought me up here and she showed me the graves. Not just anybody can see the graves. You have to know the person that lives and owns the property. So let me go back into the woods and take a picture of my fourth great-grandparents' headstones. This is my fourth great-grandparents, Jesse and Anna McMurtry Webb's grave. Doesn't look like much, but back in the 1700s, they had a child, an infant, that died and was buried right here at this spot in the 1700s. So that's before 1836, the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, removed the Native Americans to reservations. Before they were removed, what the Indians would do, I hate to say this, but this is the way it was in the 1700s. If they saw a grave, they would dig up the body and scalp the body for the scalp. So the body was always sort of hidden over time. And in this case, once the parents were buried, it was after 1836. So they had, if you look at the picture up or left, is the old headstone that was here. And what you see now, you can actually read the names. This recording was made in the late 1950s. It's a story told by my grandmother's uncle, Arthur Webb. The story is about his father, Andrew Jackson Webb's uncle, and he had 6 uncles. So I don't know which one it is, but story of him killing an Indian in East Tennessee.
Was telling about what I heard Pap say about his uncle in Tennessee, about an Indian killing some 2 little girls and scalping them and cutting their fingers and toes off and putting them on his shot pouch and had the scalps in his shot pouch, but he had them on the outside. Well, this here uncle of my daddy's, there was 8 or 9 boys in the bunch, and I never heard him say anything about a sister. But they all scattered except his daddy. And so this sheriff feller, he wore a number 5 shoe and weighed a little better than 200 pounds. And they said a horse just absolutely couldn't outrun him 200 yards. That is impossible. And so they hunting that Indian the next day, and said he spotted him at the head of a holler. They didn't have nothing on these old flint rock guns, muzzle loaders, and such as that thing. And Pap said that he didn't think that when he shot at anything that he could miss. And said the Indian shot at him, he shot at the Indian, and said he knows that he hit that Indian. And said that he didn't have even a pocket knife in his pocket. But by golly, there's a distance and shoot where they shot at one another. And the Indian throwed his gun down, broke to run, and my daddy's uncle throwed his gun down and taken right down that holler. And they got away down the holler while the Indian hung his foot in a Mustang grapevine and fell where on kind of was ripped in that holler. And when he did, why, Doc said his uncle was crowding him so close that he went right on top of him. Well, when he did, why, he fell. And the Indian had a big knife on him. He said he grabbed that knife out and put him on his arm so he couldn't use it. And said when they done that he happened to see on the fingers and toes dangling on this here shot pouch of the Indian. And said when he did, why, I said it made him mad. And said he just taken and peeled out their Indian's hair, scalp off around and just peeled it off. And said his uncle had that there Indian scalp.
Boy, that was uplifting, wasn't it? No, after putting this all together today, I was just thinking about the pioneers. They really had it rough. But then Native Americans, it was a lot rougher for them. Then you stop and think, African Americans that have slaves as ancestors, I can't even begin to imagine what they went through. I hate to end on a negative note. I can only hope that moving forward in the future, we can all show more love and caring for one another and more equality for one another. Have a good evening.